Welcome to What Is It About the Weather, where weather is always the theme, but the weather is seldom our topic. I hope since we last touched base, you've had an enjoyable, and interesting, and intertwined weather week. I know around here it's a chaotic season, with or without weather being involved. Last weekend was Black Friday, and when the last episode came out, and then, that kind of follows it. You may as well call it Black Weekend between the travel and the sales continuing. This stuff just tends to not end as precisely as they make it out to be. And that rolled into Cyber Monday, or again, Cyber, however long the companies needed it to last to sell the stuff they wanted to sell. But theoretically, somehow we're supposed to get back to normal Tuesday. And I hope for most people, really that things to get back to normal for you sometime this week. Around the globe, I know it's not as chaotic, although a lot of people, this Cyber Monday thing particularly does kind of carry over to other parts of the globe. It used to, when I was in Chile, I would be able to get good deals that time of year as well, or, they kind of picked up on the Cyber Monday, although some have moved it around at different times. In my case, though, I also did have a very interesting, specifically weather week. We got the first rain we've had, meaningful rain in the region in a couple of months. I know there's been some areas that got some measurable rain in the meantime, but I'm talking, 100th of an inch type of stuff. So that was nice. It was good to finally get some rain in the region, although, it's just a drop in the bucket of how much is really needed. But I also had a tornado warning. For the first time in a long time, many years that I can think of, I was in the cone of a tornado warning. It was odd. I was out hoping to get some pictures, and it was more of run-of-the-mill weather pictures. There was nothing particularly exciting going on, and sirens went off, and I was getting ready to pack up, and the next thing I know, someone pops out the door looking for the tornado, and I'm like, shelter would really be a better idea. Hunkering down for a little while until we know it's passed, and they did. They went and sought shelter, and as did I. And knew exactly where I was going to go, had all my things planned out. So fortunately, nobody that I know of died from the ones, or any significant injuries from the ones around us. There had been some, in the region in the previous day or two as well, and there were a few deaths, unfortunately. But for the most part, just sort of an oddity. I don't think the tornado sirens have gone off in quite some time in some of these places. In any case, I think, that's weather aside. The more interesting thing really had to be these weather in or asthma induced, I guess I should say, thunderstorms that have happened in Australia. It's still a big topic, and I think the interesting thing is, alluded to it last week with the pain episode, and I think we'll do a future episode on it. But what was probably the most interesting aspect of it was all the meteorologists going, I did not know that, or I had not really thought about that. And, really sparked an interest, kind of a reverse of what we do, with this podcast, I guess, is get interest within the meteorological community for this sort of connection that they hadn't really, thought about or touched on. So there was a lot of coverage, and I know the folks down in Australia, there's continues to be a lot of coverage news-wise. It was such a dominant event, and so many people were surprised to hear about it, that I think it's continued to make news. As I, was even, kind of reviewing things before sitting down to review the episode, I noticed that folks still kind of, talking about it, learning about it, sites updated with new information that had some old brochures, etc. So, again, a good reminder and a good opportunity to make those connections and enhance the science. And I do think we'll do a future episode on it. But this week's main topic is going to be, is weather responsible for the fact that I speak English? Now, it's an interesting question. And you may be thinking to yourself, what in the world does Mark speaking English have anything to do with the weather? Or whether, for that matter, anybody who's listening to this podcast in English, in some ways it's going to touch on the fact that we're trying to understand if a weather event or weather events specifically played a dominant role in the fact of so many people speaking English. So let's step back a minute. We kind of need to set the environment here, because that's a pretty heady sort of question. But if you think about the role of English across the globe, or England or the UK across the globe, you really got to go back to this time period around the 16th century or the 1500s. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say this is the only thing, but we'll get into why it was a specific thing when we talk about the role of the Spanish Armada and the events that transpired that were weather-related. But we're also need to really understand of why that event would matter to this scale. And in this period, let's say 1500s, I know it's kind of hard to capture it all in around a specific date or whatever, was a big period for European expansion. And again, it had started before that, and it would continue after that. But we were also at a time frame when you had some different regional powers coming and going. And specifically at that time, Spain and Portugal were probably more prominent. England was not the big player. Not saying they didn't have a role, but the dominant players were Spain and Portugal. And, they had made the big push initially into the Americas, into some of the exploration around the globe. Part of that connection, though, was religious in nature as well. So they had a lot of support from the Catholic Church, which was the dominant area of Christianity at the time, although the Protestant Reformation movement had started to kick off in other countries like the Netherlands. And again, I realize all these countries may not have been precisely known by the names we know them today, but in that region, and in England specifically, whereas, France, Spain, Portugal had remained more influenced by the Catholic Church. So all that was going on wasn't just about economics, even though that was certainly a big thing. And when I say economics, expansion in the Americas, yes, I realize it's partly about territory, but it was about territory for resources more than it was about territory for physical expansion, or at least, that's my take on it. Certainly different historians are going to have different play. And anytime, I should give a disclaimer, I'm not a historian, so you're getting, while well-researched from my perspective, when I try to investigate these things, I certainly don't have the years of background to say what, a definitive situation. So you've got economics going on, you've got religion going on, and you've also got this aspect that sea was king, all right? To get anywhere in a fast method, and fast is a very, I get, we should quantify that it's still a relative term, I guess, because moving over land was very slow. It was tedious. You couldn't do it in large groups easily, whereas you put some people on a ship, there was nothing to really stop the ship from moving around the globe unless, there were no winds. But the world had come under, this whole exploration phase, which we were doing by sea. Certainly we weren't doing anything in the air yet, and land was slow. All right, it could take, multiple times as much to get somewhere, as long as that location was fairly accessible by sea. And it has a lot to do with why so many things were founded so close to coastal areas. So, as I mentioned, England was kind of playing catch up. Not to say that they weren't, a dominant power, but actually the United Kingdom in England really didn't even exist then. It was a group in and of itself, right? That it wasn't really formally known at the time that this was taking place. You also had, like I said, different people vying for the prominence on the sea, and Spain certainly had its things. Some of the early circumnavigation, Portugal had its things, and England, though, could lay claim in the late 1500s. I think it was 1581 when it was completed. Well, actually, I take that back. 1581 was when Francis Drake became knighted by the then Queen. And he was knighted for the first circumnavigation that had happened in the preceding years under a single expedition in which one person remained captain the whole time. So it wasn't believed to be the first circumnavigation, but I guess you could call it the first continuous navigation under a single leadership. So there's all sorts of these caveats. Some people will call it the first circumnavigation because of that, but technically, it's all, how we look at things, right? It's all the perspective we have to play with that. So On the flip side of that, there was a lot of belief because people like Francis Drake they were private companies. They weren't necessarily, this was not a royal navy, whereas Spain had very much had this royal navy that was going on and well established and prominent, powerful in the Atlantic Ocean at that time, and even parts of the Pacific, but really in the Atlantic. So that's what's going on in the sea. Well-known English folks sailing, right, but not necessarily so much a Royal Navy. Well-established Spanish Navy. On the flip side of all that, you also had a connection between Spain and England due to a marriage between royalty in both countries that had kind of quelled the Protestant movement in England. However, then someone dies. The Queen dies. Her sister takes over because the Queen had no children. And the sister is very much pro-Protestant. So now we've got this religious thing coming back into play. And so Spain was going to take care of all this. I could ramble on for hours about all the nuances here, but Spain, with the blessing of the church, was going to go squash the Protestant rebellion that was essentially taking place in England at the time. And it was believed that England, and particularly the city of London, was very vulnerable. Not only was there not a standing navy per se, but there really wasn't much of a standing army. So Spain had put together this armada, and again, this Sir Francis Drake, did a little preemptive nudging, had sailed into a port and done some counterstrikes because there was concern of this thing coming, and had destroyed some Spanish ships. But here it was, big armada, over 100 ships, heading north, 30,000 troops, was going to pick up another 30,000 in the Netherlands. So, again, very close to the English coast, and get the 60,000 roughly, and again, these are based on the estimates that I've seen, people, bring them into England and, do their thing. Okay, that was the general game plan. And if that had been successful, right, certainly English would not probably have turned to be the dominant language, or very, should never say never, but based on the trajectories at that time, there's a good chance English would have not become the language that it is today, nor would England have had the influence around the globe that it ultimately had. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect of it is, let's assume for a moment Spain didn't go and do this thing. You could argue that the Spanish Armada would have remained in dominant position, but let's talk about why that is. So you've got these ships sailing north. They needed to pick up these extra troops, though, and that was a big part of the problem. So they were heading north, and for those that don't know the region, and I talked about it in the D-Day episode as well, English Channel is not a very wide thing. It's the small piece of ocean that is the divider between France and Spain. But as we talked about with D-Day, it can be an area of tremendous storms. And given that there's a lot of areas around here that aren't what I would call natural ports, or a lot of bluffs, there aren't necessarily, it's not like, and those in the U.S. sometimes may not appreciate this, especially in places like the southern U.S., coastal areas where I grew up. There's miles and miles and miles and miles of beach, right? That, just about any ships could come on shore just about anywhere, or, troops from ships, and not even be seen, particularly back then. But it just isn't the case with the geography and the topography that exist around the English Channel. So, ships going north have half their troops, going to have to stop and get the rest of them. That meant putting into the area around Calais. Now, I apologize if I get any of my pronunciations wrong, to wait for these troops. Now, already the English had started to attack them as they moved towards that position, and had kind of used up some of the Spanish supplies. Now, the benefit England had is they were able to go back to port and get additional supplies. But once the Spanish ships anchored in this region, waiting for these additional troops to arrive so that they could transport the full allotment of troops, The English did an interesting thing in that they put in what would, best way to think about it is if you've ever thought of a Molotov cocktail or have ever heard of it, it's basically you've got this thing that it's a fire, right? And you throw this fire and the fire spreads. And fire has been a very effective weapon over time. It's not a new thing. So essentially these ships were set on fire and sent into the area where all these Spanish ships were tightly anchored. And as you can imagine, fire on wood ships spreads real easy. And that was the concern all of a sudden, right? So while the English had been a nuisance to the fleet Spanish Armada so far, it had actually caused minimal damage in the scheme of things. Yes, it had run them low on ammunition and some other things, but it had not by any means had a, percentage-wise a major impact. And that's actually one of the things that will come out of all this is the battles themselves were not the deciding factor in the reduction of ships. And the same thing happened here. Now, part of it was many of the ships cut their anchors, right, which is a really dangerous thing to do. But pulling up an anchor wasn't quite as easy back then as it is now. So they cut their anchors to get out of the harbor and again, the area as quickly as possible so that they wouldn't become victim to these fire ships. So the wisdom of Drake, amongst others, is the retreat that might be to the south, which would be back towards Spain, they did cut off. So these ships, the only option they had at that point was to sail north and would sail around what is, today the United Kingdom and Ireland, and then return back to Spain more in the open ocean. Well, that's where things get a bit more tricky, all right? But keep in mind that ultimately, more than half the Spanish Armada would be lost before it got back to Spain. But let's get into the weather connection now and talk about whether weather was really the ultimate piece in the puzzle. So here we are, we're in the August time frame, 1588. Ships had to rush out of an anchored position, many without anchors, and they're heading through what, not uncommonly is some very dangerous seas when weather comes about. So there's a good documentation of the kind of multiple storms that would come through the region as not only as they headed north, okay, to get above England, but would then take the turn to go west and ultimately, along the coast of Ireland back to Spain. Again, show notes, check it out. So a lot of these storms would take their toll on individual ships, okay, and some of the, there's logs that talk about some of the different sinkings. So different storms would pop through, and essentially, if a ship doesn't have an anchor and can't harbor, itself to ride out a storm, it becomes very vulnerable and it can get crashed up against rocks. Again, a lot of the geography in this region is not conducive for a ship surviving well out in the open seas, but and then add to that it couldn't anchor. So kind of a scattered fleet, ships having a hard time. But probably the biggest single event would be when they turn the corner and we're off the coast of Ireland. So remember, this Armada, to begin with, I think it's somewhere in roughly the 120 ship range, when it left Spain. Certainly more ships have been lost by now, but, running low on supplies, right? Much less ammunition. It's just food to survive. So a group of these ships tried to take refuge off the coast of Ireland. And again, another storm would rise and take out another 20 ships, specifically and even in one specific storm. And some of these are very well documented because it was a concentrated group of ships that would die, or ships that would sink and lives that would be lost. Ultimately, back by October, less than half the fleet would return to Spain. Now, you could argue that they've still got half an armada. And as history will tell us, right, it's not like the Spanish went away after this. And we would even have the Anglo-Spanish Wars that would take place many years later. However, there's two pivotal things that would happen here. One is, in the very short term, Spain would lose its ability to control the seas and potentially dictate where other powers in the time, or a rising power like the UK, would be able to gain footholds in different areas. On the flip side of that, indeed, you all of a sudden had a empowered English community, even though it was just coming about as a country itself at the time, that felt emboldened to continue its quest for global expansion, right? So, end of day, the real question that we have to get into with all this is, how much of this whole thing that played out was due to weather, and was weather the kind of the final thing and the major player? So, again, reading through different sources, and these are fairly well documented and fairly good records that are kept. Some basic things. In terms of ships lost in battle, in this loss of over half the fleet, or half the armada, very few, a small percentage. So even of the ships lost, it's probably, the number is less than 10%, or, let's say it's in the 10% range of the ships that actually were sunk were due to battle, or, in a battle environment. So in contrast, the rest were lost due to storms or weather-induced. You could always argue maybe someone drove a ship poorly, or piloted it into some rocks that they just missed. But the rest are believed to be the final outcome, or the final loss was due to a weather-related event. Now, the nuance in here, of course, is how much of the behavior was driven by the fact that they were running low on food, ammunition, and while maybe not having sunk a ship, damaged them in a certain way that would make them more susceptible to the weather, such as the fire ships that caused all these Spanish Armada ships to cut their anchor lines and to sail without anchor. So certainly the tactics were at play, but you could also argue that even without these things, if they had either A, been able to sail back south, and I think that's the critical thing is, had they been able to sail back south through the English Channel and back down to Spain, I don't think the devastation would have ever been this much. So you have to give one part of it to the tactics that cut off the channel, cut off the southern route of return to Spain. I think that's a key player. But there's no doubt that had weather been different, had the weather patterns been different that year, and they had been, the general climatology in the English Channel during the earlier part of the 16th century had been more mild, even though it's a time of year known for storms. So had the weather not turned as violent, there's no doubt that, generally speaking, and there's certainly some additional ships would have been lost. I don't care how you slice it, with the English ships being able to resupply, but under the right weather conditions, it would have been more of a chase, right, back to Spain. And I think at some point they would have gotten back there. So there's no doubt that through the direct storm implications and weather implications, that a majority of the ships lost were due to the weather. Okay, I think we could say that hands down. Now, history will always debate the aftermath of this, and like I said, I alluded to some of the different things, but in a short and sweet sort of way, did weather have something to do with the Spanish Armada losing half its strength within a 3-month period, and in turn potentially reshape the exploration such that English would become the major language, where I live in the United States, but even other parts of the world? I think the answer very fundamentally is yes. You betcha that's what happened here. As with all things, it's never as simple as one factor, but there's been a fair amount written about the likelihood and how much weather played a role. So, I mean, just think about it this way. What if the U.S., as I know it today, had never occurred? Well, certainly it wouldn't have occurred had things not transpired the way they did with, the influence of England and that role in the United States. And you can even look at other parts of the America where Spain was more dominant and the way the future would transpire there. Just imagine if the original colonies of the United States had either been Spanish dominated or had been French dominated or Portugal or anything else. We might be looking at a very different outcome today. And, Spanish may not have been my second language. It may have been my first language. In any case, it's always interesting, fun to explore these things, right? So check mark is yes. It's most definitely likely that the reason I speak English today was heavily influenced by the weather. Just leave it at that. All right. So I've enjoyed I like doing these history things, but I noticed, all three of the initial episodes in this kind of series or this arc have a European dominance. So for the next time, I will try to get away from Europe and even the sea, D-Day, even though, certainly other methods of transportation had started to take a key role. Even you could narrow it down. The English Channel played a prominent role in 2 of the first episodes. So I'm going to look for maybe, it'd be a little more difficult to come by. And I don't want to do, an obvious one might be to do like World War II and the winter on the Russian-German front. And I'm going to try to stay away from that one because that's got a lot of nuances in it that I'm not. It's going to take a long time to investigate. I might do it in the future, but I am going to look for an interior one to see if maybe there is some snow event or even a river crossing. Because it's always amazing to me how much rivers, as a natural boundary for many years, even to today, up until today, can serve as a deterrent or a tricky border, a which to cross. But look for a weather event that maybe takes on some different nuances to it. So that'll be, like I said, I'm trying to do one of these a quarter. Thanks again for those who had suggested this episode. I know Jack was the first to write about it, but I've had multiple people send it along. So thank you for suggesting it. As always, I enjoy researching these things. And, hopefully, as with all things, we learn a little bit more. And usually I hear more from historians along the way about what I got right and what I got wrong. So if I hear anything particularly interesting, I'll make sure to pass it along as it goes by. All right, as I mentioned, got rain, and it was such a good thing. But it made me think, how much rain do spots on the globe get on average? So we get in our interesting tidbit. And what I found out is, on average, if you're at an average spot somewhere on the globe, you get approximately 90 millimeters or roughly 3.5 inches. And again, it depends which resource you use of rain or precipitation. I want to quantify that. It's precipitation turned into its liquid form. So if snow is dominant, it's still what we call the snow water equivalent or the liquid equivalent. How much do we get at a spot? If you pick any given spot, what's the average around the globe? So I'll let you ponder that for a minute. And as you can imagine, 3.5 inches per month or 90 millimeters per month, for some people may seem like a lot. Some people it may not sound like much. For me, where I grew up, we were slightly above that average. But I think about places I've lived, like in Chile and other areas, that get nowhere near that much, which means there's some people that get an awful lot. And you even think about, whether it's other parts of Chile that I visited or parts around the globe that get significantly less than that. Somewhere it's got to be made up. The interesting, I think one of the interesting pieces of that is a lot of that's over the ocean, right? Some of the more prominent rain positions are out over sea. So, short of you living on a boat, you'd never know that. But there are areas where you look at different rainforest, like Brazil being a prime example of a very big geographic area, or parts of Africa that are these dense rainforests that get significantly more. And they might find that average number disturbingly small. So, or maybe they want to move to that area. But yeah, just kind of the interesting tidbit of the week. All right, time to wrap up. We're getting up to the 30-minute mark here. As I mentioned, I think we'll do a weather and asthma episode somewhere down the road, particularly because it's kind of timely with this topic's going on. But I want to get back to technology, and I think whether it's the next episode or at least in the next couple, we're going to start talking big data and the role, kind of the circular role of weather in what has now become this big catchphrase of big data. So look forward to that. Now, how you can get hold of me. What is it about the weather at gmail.com, of course, and what is it about weather.com is the website, and you get all the basics. You can get in touch with me via the email. You can go to the website to learn how to follow, whether it's catching up with me on social media, or again, just following the link for just the podcast. I know some people prefer that, and that remains available and will so. And of course, you find out more about supporting us there. The Rate, Share, Validate, Pledge, you've heard me mention it, RSVP. So particularly if you're an iTunes person, consider going in and rating the podcast and giving a review. It's helpful. Discovery is one of always the tricky things for podcast. And, most of us don't have big budgets and those sort of things to spend on advertising. So it's through these different sort of things, through whether it's rating us on iTunes, whether it's sharing, as I've mentioned before. Let somebody know about the podcast. That'd be great. Validate. Always love your feedback and pledge if you want to consider supporting us. I've had people ask me about the store again, and actually I was communicating with one of the people about a shirt today that has been due them for a while, and then it got sent to the wrong place, but hopefully we'll get it to them soon. I've been underwhelmed with the quality of products out there. So if you know somebody or one of these online stores that you've had good success with, let me know. I've been underwhelmed about either the quality of the product or the printing. It's kind of been a contrast. Like the most comfortable and the shirts I like, the printing just wasn't very good. So feel free to pop that along to me at what is it about the weather at gmail.com or on the form on the website. So until next time, may you have interesting and certainly entwined weather that leaves you pondering the ongoing exploration we have here of the many ways that weather touches our lives. Because as we know, there's much more to weather than the weather itself.